A lot of games, especially major AAA games, have a bit of a hard time exploring themes of morality. As someone who views games as a pleasurable pastime, but also as works of art, this saddens me a little bit. The human condition is vast, but a lot of games have trouble discussing morality in a complex, deep, or subtle way. All is not lost, however, because there are still plenty of smaller indie games that have explored the murky web of morality and philosophy. Of all these games that have tried to tackle issues about morality, one of the standouts is Papers, Please by Lucas Pope, the self-described dystopian document thriller. Today we are going to be talking about how Papers, Please talks about morality and what other developers can learn from it. This video will contain spoilers, so if you want to go into the game blind, feel free to watch this video at a later date. Make sure you have your passports ready, because we're going to discuss Papers, Please. Without further ado, let's begin. Before dissecting Papers, Please, I want to talk about how pieces of art can explore morality in general, and how this gives us a greater appreciation of the world. According to authors like C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, G.K. Chesterton, and George MacDonald, humans do not create in a vacuum. Put another way, you cannot get something from nothing. When an author writes a book, a painter draws a painting, a director creates a film, or a designer develops a game, they take influence from the physical world, referred to as the primary world by these authors. Tolkien called the act of human creation subcreation, and the worlds that are created are called secondary worlds. Our secondary worlds can have a lot of differences from the real world, but these authors believe that at their core, our secondary worlds should reflect the morality of the primary world. In other words, genocide and slavery are still as evil in Middle-earth as they are in the real world, and philanthropy is still as good in Narnia as it is in the real world. We create our art to reflect reality in some manner, and to give the observer a new perspective on the world. According to Tolkien, quote, "We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves." In the same way that we might gain a new appreciation for wolves after immersing ourselves in fantasy, so too can we gain a new insight into morality after exploring its subtleties in fantastical settings. Funnily enough, Tolkien never believed that visual mediums like film could create fantasy as well as literature, because the visuals filled in too much of the world instead of allowing the observer to fill in these details with their own mind. Even though video games do not require as much of this kind of participation, they are fundamentally built around interactivity with the mechanics. Players might not get to decide what the forest looks like, but they get to decide whether they want to burn it down or not. So how can games take advantage of their interactive nature to offer the player a deep exploration of morality? Enter Papers, Please, an exploration of the morality of border security, Cold War politics, and the iron cage of bureaucracy. The player plays as a passport inspector for the Ministry of Administrations in the oppressive state of Arstotzka. Players spend the game scouring over everybody's passport and entry papers to make sure that everything is in order before letting them into the country. The player is given money for every person they correctly process, which the player must earn to feed and keep their family warm. However, if the player makes too many mistakes, they will be punished with fines. This incentivizes the player to work quickly, but not so quickly that the player will make mistakes. As the game progresses, more and more rules are added, which increases the pressure on the player because it takes longer and longer to process a single person. This is where Papers, Please throws in a twist. Sometimes, players will be presented with a moral question. For example, this man who is coming to your country to get medical care that is illegal in his home country. If he doesn't get it, he will probably die. Unfortunately, his paperwork is not in order. Do you let this man pass? If you do, you will receive a citation and possibly a fine. It is highly possible you will not have enough money to feed your family if you let him through. This is the first lesson which we can learn from Papers, Please. In order for a moral choice to be effective, it must have consequence. In many other games with moral choice systems, the player makes moral choices, but there will be little to no consequence for moral or immoral behavior. Take Fable 2, for example. Throughout the game, players make a series of choices, which will either make their character more angelic or demonic. The player's avatar changes to reflect this, but in the end, no matter what the player does, the story doesn't change, and the player always ends up defeating evil in the end. This shows the player that all their previous choices had little to no meaning, because in the end, nothing changes because of their choices. Papers, Please, on the other hand, reflects the player's choices. While other games might settle for a couple of endings, Papers, Please goes all out and has a total of 20 endings, which reflect the player's choices throughout the game. These can range from the player getting imprisoned for their crimes, to the government being overthrown by the shady and mysterious Order of the Ezek Star. While having the ending of the game reflect the player's actions is important, it is also important that the player feels the consequences on a micro level as well. As I said before, seemingly moral behavior is often punished with fines and citations, while debatably immoral behavior is rewarded. Being a nice person will make your life difficult in Papers, Please, and this forces the player to ask themselves if it is truly worth it. The newspaper is also an effective way to show the more global repercussions of their actions. Oftentimes, one of the headlines will relate to a moral choice the player has made the previous day. For example, one day a brothel worker asks you to reject a certain person from entering the country, because they are convinced that he will murder them. If the player chooses to let him through, the next day the newspaper will have a headline about a group of murders at a brothel. Papers, Please also teaches us that morality is best when it is not tied to a number. Beyond the fact that morality is very hard to define, and assigning morality points is a subjective judgment from the developer, there are other problems with assigning numeric values to morality. Take the infamous series, for example. In this game, players make a series of choices, and these choices will either give the player good or evil points. This undermines the whole point of having a morality system. Interesting choices. Once the player starts down one of these paths, it will be hard for them to make a choice that strays from that path, because making that choice will lock them out of abilities later in the game. Your players will never have the chance to think about what the actual best choice is and analyze the morality, because the game will nudge them to take one of the choices based only on their previous choices. This drags the game out of the moral gray area. The moral gray area removes notions of pure good and pure evil, and forces the player to make a choice that doesn't strongly fit into either camp, ultimately forcing the player to ask themselves what they feel is the best course of action. Papers, Please has no numeric representation of morality, and the game's choices are stronger for it. When this man asks you to let his wife through, even though her papers aren't in order, it doesn't force the player to choose one side or the other because it will give them more good or evil points. Instead, this forces the player to weigh the harms that this could do to their own family and the harms of splitting up this family, which is ultimately much more complex, and therefore a much more interesting choice. Before closing this video, I want to emphasize the fact that not every game needs a moral choice system. Including morality systems will take away some of the control the developer has over the narrative, so if your game has a specific story you want to tell, a morality system might not be the best choice for that. Games like The Beginner's Guide or Portal have very specific stories that couldn't be told using branching morality systems. Understanding when not to use a morality system can be just as important as knowing when to use one. Even if you do include a morality system, you don't necessarily need to follow all these guidelines to a T. Understanding why these guidelines exist and what effect they have on players will help you break the rules in a way that still leads to an interesting morality system. If you can use the effect of not following one of these guidelines to advance the narrative or develop another part of the game, changing the rules might actually be the right choice. In Undertale, if players want to get either the genocide or pacifist endings, they will need to play in a very specific way. Normally, this is not a good thing, since it removes the interesting moral decisions that the player needs to make and forces them down a linear path. But Undertale gets away with it because it uses these linear paths to comment on conflict resolution in RPGs during the pacifist route, and on the genocide route, the game develops commentary about the morally reprehensible actions the players are willing to take in order to see all of the game's content. In summary, Papers, Please presents the player with some of the most interesting moral choices in gaming, and it develops the framework needed to present these choices to the player through its design. The game shows us that every choice in a game needs to have a mechanical and narrative consequence for the player's actions to show that the world responds to their choices. It also shows that divorcing its morality from numbers allows it to provide the player with more freedom to choose the choice that they actually feel is morally correct. In this way, Papers, Please realizes the vision of morality presented by Lewis, Chesterton, MacDonald, and Tolkien. The secondary world allows the player to explore morality to its fullest, and the game reflects the morality of the real world, and thus it gives the player a deeper understanding of these moral issues in the real world, as any good moral choice should. If you have enjoyed this discussion about how morality is built into Papers, Please, feel free to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. Until then, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.